They laughed the first time they saw the hole in the cliff. Not because a man carving stone was strange. Every settlement had men who cut rock for foundations, chimneys, or retaining walls. Stone work was slow, brutal labor, but it wasn't unheard of. They laughed because of where he was carving. Not at the base of the cliff, not to shore up a slope, but straight into the rock face itself, high enough that a fall would cripple him, deep enough that a mistake could bury him alive. From the trail below, it looked like madness. A narrow ledge hacked out of sheer stone, dust falling in pale sheets as he chipped deeper, day after day, shaping a hollow where no one thought a home should exist. They said the cliff would crack. They said the weight above would come down. They said winter would turn the stone into ice and split it open. They said snow would bury the entrance and trap him inside. They said the wind would tear the heat out of it faster than any cabin ever built on open ground. They said a man belonged on the earth, not inside it. He listened and kept carving. At first, the hollow was barely deep enough to stand in. Just a rough scar in the rock, uneven and raw. He worked suspended above the ground, boots braced against stone, fingers numb from vibration and cold, shaping the cliff inch by inch. The second layer of laughter came when they realized he wasn't stopping. This wasn't a storage alcove. This wasn't a lookout. This was the start of a dwelling. Someone joked that he was building a grave with a view. Another said the cliff would outlast him, the way it always outlasted men who tried to tame it. A few warned him seriously. Rock failures were quiet until they weren't. One wrong fracture line, one freeze-thaw cycle, and the whole face could peel away. He nodded and kept going. He carved inward instead of outward, following the stone's natural seams, reading the rock the way a hunter reads tracks. Where the stone rang dense, he left it thick. Where it fractured easily, he widened the cavity, relieving pressure instead of fighting it. That alone confused them. Most men fought the land. He was negotiating with it. As the hollow deepened, the air inside it changed. Outside, the sun beat against exposed rock during the day and vanished sharply at night. Inside the cavity, temperature shift slowed. The stone absorbed heat, then released it gradually, dulling the extremes. He noticed. They didn't. The third layer of conflict came when winter approached early. Frost dusted the ridge weeks ahead of schedule. Winds hardened. Nights stretched longer. Men rushed to finish cabins, patch roofs, and stack wood. Smoke rose constantly as fires burned hotter than planned. He was still carving. Someone shouted up that he was running out of time. Someone else laughed and said the cliff would kill him before winter could. They told him stone held cold. They told him rock sucked heat like a sponge. They told him no fire could fight frozen stone. They were repeating things they had heard their whole lives. They weren't testing them. By the time snow dusted the upper ledges, the hollow had become a room. Not large, but deliberate. Walls curved inward slightly, following the natural strength of the cliff. The ceiling arched instead of flattening, distributing weight into the surrounding rock. The floor sat higher than the ledge outside, preventing meltwater from creeping in. The entrance stayed narrow, intentionally. A wide opening invites wind. A narrow one controls it. That decision triggered another wave of warnings. They said smoke would choke him. They said air would stagnate. They said fires needed space. They said he was sealing himself into a stone coffin. He ignored them. Instead of placing the fire where they expected, he offset it. The hearth sat back against the inner wall, its heat forced to travel sideways through stone before it could reach the sleeping space. A carved channel guided smoke upward and outward, lengthened on purpose, bleeding heat into the rock before release. Fire wasn't meant to roar. It was meant to charge the stone. This was not how frontier cabins worked. Cabins fought the cold directly. Big fires, open air, constant feeding. This didn't. This absorbed warmth quietly and refused to give it up quickly. The laughter turned uneasy when they noticed he wasn't rushing. Men who were afraid rushed. He didn't. He lined parts of the interior with stone where the rock fractured naturally, seating each piece carefully. Clay sealed gaps where stone met stone, locking the interior into one continuous mass. No drafts, no exposed seams, no wasted heat paths. Someone finally asked him why he didn't just build below like everyone else. He didn't answer, because explanations invite debate, and debate wouldn't keep him warm. The first night he slept inside the cliff, the fire was small, embarrassingly small. Anyone watching would have assumed it wouldn't last an hour. The wind outside screamed along the ridge, tearing heat out of exposed shelters, rattling loose boards, forcing men to wake and feed fires again and again. Inside the cliff, the fire burned low and steady. Stone around it warmed slowly, almost imperceptibly. No sudden comfort arrived. No dramatic payoff. That was the fourth conflict. Expectation versus reality. People expect survival solutions to announce themselves loudly. This one didn't. When the fire died, the interior felt only slightly warmer than the night air outside. Someone laughed the next morning and said the cliff had already won. They said he'd freeze by morning. They said stone always won. They were wrong. By dawn, frost coated the ridge thick enough to crunch. Breath burned lungs. Fingers numbed within minutes. Inside the cliff, the temperature had barely shifted. The stone released warmth gradually, steadily, refusing to dump it all at once. The air stayed dry. Smoke hadn't lingered. The narrow entrance had blocked the wind completely. He slept longer than usual. Woke clear. Didn't relight the fire immediately. That unsettled them more than anything else, because it suggested the cliff wasn't draining heat. It was storing it. The second night, the fire was the same size. The third night, smaller. The results didn't change. Outside, winter tightened its grip. Snow built up along the ridge. Cabins creaked. Wood piles shrank. Fires burned aggressively and gave little back. Inside the cliff, the temperature lagged behind the cold, never catching up to it. Men stopped laughing. They started watching. The cliff house didn't smoke constantly like the cabins did. It didn't bleed heat into the wind. It sat embedded in stone, insulated by mass, protected from exposure. Someone muttered that snow would seal the entrance shut. They waited for it. It didn't happen. The narrow opening shed snow instead of collecting it. Heat escaping through the long smoke path melted buildup gradually, keeping the exit usable without effort. That wasn't luck. It was design. Winter arrived fully then. Not with drama. With permanence. Temperatures dropped and stayed down. Storms stacked on storms. Paths vanished. The ridge went quiet in the way that means survival has narrowed. Cabins began to fail. Not catastrophically at first. Just small losses. Damp bedding. Smoke that lingered too long. Fires that demanded attention every few hours. Men woke tired, then exhausted. Inside the cliff, night stayed barring. The fire burned once. The stone held. Sleep came deep and uninterrupted. That difference became impossible to ignore. One man finally asked how deep the room went. Another asked how thick the walls were. Another asked how often he fed the fire. The answers bothered them, because they meant this had always been possible. They just hadn't thought to carve instead of stack. But winter wasn't finished. Not even close. The cliff had held through early cold, through ridicule, through doubt. The real test was still coming, because the cold that kills doesn't shout. It waits, and when it comes, it punishes mistakes that felt harmless weeks earlier. The cliff was about to be tested by the kind of storm that erases shelters built on hope alone, and whether stone would protect him, or entomb him, was something no one yet knew. The storm didn't arrive all at once. That was the mistake most men made when judging it. They expected noise first. Wind tearing through the trees. Snow blowing sideways. A sky that warned you to prepare. Instead, it arrived quietly. The air thickened. Sound carried differently. Footsteps felt muted, as if the ridge itself was holding its breath. The sky lowered without color. Not dark, not bright, just empty. That was when the older men grew uneasy. This was the kind of weather that didn't pass. This was the kind that stayed. By nightfall, snow began falling straight down, heavy and wet at first, clinging to every surface it touched. Cabins groaned as weight accumulated on roofs, already strained by weeks of cold. Smoke rose thick and sluggish, pressed downward by the low sky. Inside those cabins, fires burned hotter than usual. Men fed them constantly. They knew what came next. By morning, the snow had changed. Wet flakes hardened into dry, cutting crystals that piled faster than they could be cleared. Wind followed, not gusting, not roaring, but pushing steadily, relentlessly, driving snow into cracks, seams, and joints that had been ignored for years. This was the storm that tested workmanship. This was the storm that punished shortcuts. Cabins began to leak heat first. Not dramatically, just enough. Cold crept in through joints where logs had shrunk, through roof lines where snow packed and froze, through floors raised too high above the ground. Men woke colder than they went to sleep. They fed the fires more. Outside, the cliff house disappeared. From the trail below, snow coated the rock face uniformly. The entrance vanished into shadow and drifting white. If someone hadn't known where to look, they would have thought the cliff untouched. That unnerved them, because buried shelters suffocate. They waited for smoke. It came. Thin, controlled. A narrow plume slipped out along the rock face, hugging stone before dissolving into the wind. It didn't billow. It didn't announce warmth or desperation. It simply existed. Inside the cliff, sound vanished. Wind passed overhead without force. Snow pressed against the stone and stayed outside. The interior air barely moved. The fire burned. Small. Measured. Stone around it glowed faintly warm to the touch, but not hot. Heat soaked inward, radiating slowly through the walls, thickening the air just enough to dull the bite of winter. Hours passed. Then more. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow drifted waist-high in places. Paths disappeared entirely. Cabins became islands of smoke and struggle, their occupants trapped in cycles of feeding fire, clearing snow, and fighting exhaustion. One cabin roof sagged. Another chimney cracked. A man burned his hand feeding a fire that refused to stay alive. Inside the cliff, nothing happened. And that became the problem, because survival is expected to look like effort. When something survives quietly, it feels wrong. The second night, the wind arrived fully. Not howling, pressing. A steady force that leaned against every exposed surface, testing it patiently, like a hand that never gets tired. Snow followed it into seams, packed tight by pressure, sealing weaknesses solid. Cabins began to fail structurally. One lost part of its roof when weight shifted, and the support beam cracked. Another filled with smoke when wind reversed draft and forced it back down the chimney. Men moved between shelters to help. They slipped. They fell. Cold punished skin instantly. Inside the cliff, the entrance narrowed further under snow, but it didn't close. Heat leaking gently through the stones softened buildup, just enough to keep a breathing gap open. The long smoke channel stayed clear, warmed internally even as the exterior froze. The fire inside burned less that night. It didn't need more. The stone had already been charged. This was the part no one had anticipated. Cabins lost heat as fast as they produced it. Fire fought air and lost constantly. Stone didn't fight. It absorbed. And now it was paying that warmth back slowly, evenly, without drama. Sleep inside the cliff came easily, deep, unbroken. The storm roared outside, but didn't enter. On the third day, men stopped leaving their cabins. Snow was too deep, wind too strong. Helping others became impossible. Everyone turned inward, rationing wood, conserving strength, waiting. This was when mistakes turned deadly. Fires burned too hot, then too low. Smoke filled rooms when vents froze. Moisture condensed inside walls and froze, expanding, breaking seals. One man collapsed from exhaustion after feeding his fire all night. Another ran out of dry wood. They remembered the cliff then. Someone suggested checking on him. No one volunteered, because reaching the cliff meant crossing exposed ground, and because part of them feared what they might find. They expected silence. They expected a sealed tomb. They expected regret carved into stone. By the fourth night, the storm reached its peak. Wind screamed then, finally finding its voice, slamming into the ridge with enough force to make entire trees groan. Snow didn't fall anymore. It moved sideways. Visibility vanished. Cabins that had held for generations began to fail outright. A roof caved in under weight and vibration. A chimney collapsed inward. Men dragged families into the most intact shelters, crowding around fires that could barely keep up. Inside the cliff, the fire went out. On purpose. There was no need to relight it. Stone radiated warmth steadily, having absorbed days of controlled heat. The interior temperature dropped slowly, predictably, never plunging. No drafts, no moisture, no smoke, just stillness. He lay awake for a while, listening to nothing. And that was when the cliff earned its reputation. The storm lasted 2 more days. When it finally loosened its grip, it didn't retreat cleanly. Wind slowed. Snow softened. Temperatures stayed low. The ridge emerged damaged. Cabins sagged. Roofs were crushed. Walls leaned where logs had shifted. Men stepped outside and assessed losses with hollow eyes. Then they looked toward the cliff. Smoke rose again. Thin, steady. A figure emerged from the stone opening, brushing snow from his shoulders as if stepping out of a normal doorway. No rush. No panic. No signs of strain. That moment ended the ridicule. Not because the storm had been impressive, but because survival had been quiet. Men gathered below the cliff, staring upward. They noticed details they'd mocked before. The way the entrance angled slightly downward, shedding snow. The way the stone around it was bare, warmth having melted accumulation naturally. The way the smoke path hugged the rock, invisible unless you knew where to look. They asked questions carefully now. How thick were the walls? How often did he feed the fire? Did the stone crack? Did moisture build inside? The answers were simple and uncomfortable, because none of them involved luck. The cliff hadn't cracked because he followed its structure. The interior hadn't frozen because stone lagged temperature change. The fire hadn't suffocated him because air paths were planned, not guessed. The storm hadn't buried him because heat was guided, not wasted. One man said nothing and just touched the rock, pressing his palm against stone still faintly warm. Another laughed softly, not in mockery, but disbelief. Someone muttered that it went against everything they'd been taught, and that was true. They'd been taught to build against the land, to raise walls, to fight exposure, to force shelter into open air. This didn't. This disappeared into the mountain. The cliff house didn't dominate the landscape. It surrendered to it, and in doing so, it survived what others barely endured. But admiration came with fear, because copying it wasn't easy. Carving stone required patience most men didn't have. Understanding load paths, heat flow, airflow, moisture, all of it required thinking beyond tradition. This wasn't a trick. It was a philosophy, one that punished shortcuts and rewarded restraint. They asked if he'd build another. He shook his head. This one was enough. Winter wasn't finished, but the worst had passed. Cabins would be repaired. Lessons would be half-learned. Some would remember the cliff and adjust small things. Others would forget, but no one would laugh again, because they had seen what happened when a man didn't rush, didn't argue, didn't prove anything, and simply let the mountain do the work. The cliff had not been a gamble. It had been an agreement, and the mountain had kept its side. Winter did not end when the storm passed. That was another mistake people made. They believed survival was proven once, then secured, that if a shelter held through one disaster, the rest would be easier. But the ridge remembered storms, and winter always returned to test memory. In the weeks that followed, repairs consumed the settlement. Men replaced broken beams, shoveled collapsed roofs free, reset chimneys, sealed cracks with mud that froze too fast to cure properly. Every fix felt temporary, rushed, defensive. Firewood vanished quickly. The storm had buried fallen trees and snapped branches under drifts too deep to reach. What little dry wood remained was hoarded, guarded, rationed with quiet anxiety. Smoke still rose from cabins each morning, but thinner now, more desperate. Inside the cliff, the fire burned every other day. Sometimes not at all. Stone held heat longer than man expected. The interior stayed calm, dry, predictable. There were no spikes of warmth, followed by cold punishment. Just a slow breathing rhythm, like the mountain itself exhaling. That contrast gnawed at people, because suffering had become uneven. Some woke shivering, fingers numb, breath fogging the air inside their own homes. Others walked out of the cliff brushing snow from their boots, like it was late autumn. That imbalance created tension. Not jealousy exactly. Something quieter. A question no one wanted to say aloud. If this worked, why didn't we do it? The first man tried to imitate it poorly. He dug into a hillside near his cabin, hacking at frozen dirt and stone with brute force, widening a shallow cavity and roofing it with logs. He built a fire inside on the first night and nearly suffocated when smoke backed up, trapped by snow and poor airflow. They pulled him out coughing, eyes burned red. The lesson was immediate. This wasn't a hole. It was a system. The second attempt was more cautious. Two men studied the cliff from a distance, watching smoke patterns, noting how snow melted unevenly along stone. They traced airflow paths with gloved hands, guessed at angles, depths, thickness. They began carving into rock weeks later. Slow, careful. The mountain resisted. Stone dulled tools. Progress measured in inches per day. They quit before spring, leaving a scarred alcove that never became shelter. That failure taught another lesson. This wasn't fast, and it wasn't forgiving. Meanwhile, winter continued. Temperatures dropped again. Not violently, relentlessly. Cabins that had survived the storm now struggled under prolonged cold. Moisture trapped in walls froze and expanded nightly. Logs creaked and shifted. Nails loosened. Seams widened. Firewood ran low. Men burned furniture. Fence posts. Anything dry. Inside the cliff, nothing changed. The air remained dry. The stone never cracked. The fire never roared. That consistency unsettled people more than the storm had, because disaster felt fair. Endurance did not. They began visiting, not asking questions, just standing near the entrance, warming hands against stone, pretending coincidence. He never turned them away, but he never offered instruction either. He answered only what was asked, and what was asked grew more specific. How far does it go? How thick is the stone above? How did you decide where to cut? Why didn't the ceiling drip? Why didn't smoke build up? Each answer stripped another layer from tradition. He didn't choose the cliff for shelter. He chose it for stability. Stone didn't care about wind, didn't rot, didn't flex. The mountain wasn't fighting winter. It ignored it, and so did the shelter. The real turning point came during the second blizzard. Smaller, shorter, but crueler. This one arrived at night without warning. Wind slammed into weakened cabins already stretched thin by weeks of cold. Snow packed into cracks left unrepaired. Fire struggled. A chimney collapsed silently while a family slept. Smoke filled the room. They woke choking, barely escaped. The cabin burned by morning. That loss broke something. Not wood. Confidence. Because they had survived the big storm and assumed they were safe now. They weren't. That night, the cliff filled. Not with people moving in, but with presence. Men and women stood near it during the worst of the wind, sheltering against rock, letting stone block force while they waited for gusts to pass before moving. The cliff became an anchor, a fixed point of calm. That's when the narrative shifted. It wasn't just clever anymore. It wasn't unusual. It was necessary. Someone said aloud what others had avoided. If this is the future, we're behind. No one argued, but fear followed. Because how many cliffs were there? Not every man could carve stone. Not every ridge offered the same structure. The mountain had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. That thought unsettled them deeply, because it meant survival wasn't equal. It depended on patience, observation, restraint. Traits not evenly distributed. Spring came late. When it did, thaw created new problems. Cabins flooded as snow melt pooled beneath raised floors. Mud softened foundations. Wood warped. Inside the cliff, water never entered. Drainage paths cut subtly into stone guided melt away from the entrance. The interior remained dry. That detail stunned people most. They had accepted warmth. But dryness? That felt like magic. It wasn't. It was gravity. He had carved with slope. Let water leave. Men stared at their soggy floors and realized how little they'd thought about where water went. They'd always fought it, never guided it. The cliff shelter revealed mistake after mistake without speaking. By summer, repairs were complete. Life returned to routine. But something fundamental had shifted. Children pointed at the cliff when passing. Stories changed. The laughter vanished from retellings. Now the story wasn't about foolishness. It was about foresight, about listening, about not needing to prove strength by building tall. Winter came again. They were ready, not because they had copied the cliff, but because they had learned from it. Cabins were sealed better. Fires were moderated. Stone was incorporated where possible. Earth was used instead of fought. And when storms returned, damage was less severe. But still, the cliff outperformed everything. Consistently. Quietly. Year after year. Eventually, people stopped talking about it, which was the highest form of respect. Because things that become legend fade. Things that become standard endure. The cliff was no longer strange. It was simply there. Unmoved. Unimpressed. The mountain hadn't changed. Men had. They no longer rushed to build against nature. They waited. They watched. They asked warning questions instead of bold ones. And in every storm that followed, when wind pressed and snow piled, there was always that one place on the ridge where smoke rose thin and steady, proving again that survival didn't belong to the loudest or the strongest. It belonged to the patient. And the mountain remembered that. Years passed without ceremony. No one marked the date when the cliff shelter stopped being talked about entirely. It simply slid from conversation into assumption. Children grew up knowing it as part of the ridge, the way one knows a bend in a trail or a certain tree that always stands after storms. It was just there, and that was its final victory, because the most successful things don't demand attention forever. They earn silence. The man aged quietly. His beard grew heavier with gray. His hands stiffened in the mornings. He moved slower across stone steps he had carved himself years earlier. But the shelter never needed him to fight for it again. That was the point. He hadn't built something that required constant correction. He built something that corrected itself. Stone didn't rot. Earth didn't peel. The cliff absorbed heat in summer, released it gently through fall, and resisted cold in winter with the same indifference it had shown for centuries. While cabins were rebuilt, expanded, repaired, and sometimes abandoned, the cliff stayed unchanged. Men came and went. The mountain didn't. During one particularly brutal winter many years later, a storm arrived worse than the first. Worse because people weren't expecting it. They had grown confident, prepared, complacent. The snowfall was heavier than memory. Wind carved drifts higher than doors. Temperatures dropped faster than fires could respond. This time, damage spread across the ridge. Roofs collapsed. Smoke froze inside chimneys. Animals were lost. And once again, the cliff stood. But something different happened. People didn't run to it. They didn't gather. They didn't crowd its entrance. Because they no longer needed to. They had learned. Their homes weren't perfect, but they weren't fragile either. The shelter had done its work long before that storm ever arrived. not by housing everyone, but by teaching them how to stop fighting what they could never win against. After that winter, no one called the cliff shelter clever. They called it obvious. And that was the final shift. Because when something radical becomes obvious, it means the lesson has taken root. The man eventually stopped lighting fires inside. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. The stone held enough warmth from the season before. The interior remained stable even through nights that cracked water barrels outside. He slept wrapped lightly. He woke rested. No smoke marked the entrance some mornings. Still, the shelter worked. People noticed. They understood. This wasn't about fire. It never had been. It was about placement, about alignment, about letting the land do the labor. When the man died, there was no monument, no marker carved into stone, no inscription. They buried him on the ridge, facing the cliff, under a sky he had learned to read better than anyone. The shelter remained, untouched, unclaimed. No one took it over. That mattered, because it was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be understood. Years later, travelers passed through the ridge. They noticed the shelter before anything else. They asked questions. Who built it? Why? How long did it take? Locals answered simply. He listened. That answer confused outsiders. They wanted measurements, dates, tools. They wanted instructions. But instructions without patience were useless. Some tried to copy it anyway. Most failed, because they dug too fast, or too shallow, or without understanding airflow, or without accepting that stone dictated the terms. The cliff shelter wasn't a trick. It was a conversation, and the mountain only spoke to those willing to wait. That's why it endured, not because it was hidden, but because it wasn't loud. It didn't challenge nature. It stepped aside and let nature pass. In a world obsessed with building taller, faster, bigger, the shelter remained small, slow, and stubbornly grounded, and it outlived them all. Even now, long after the ridge is quieted, long after cabins have been replaced and paths forgotten, the cliff still holds its shape. Snow still gathers above it. Wind still scours the rock face. Inside, the temperature barely changes. Stone remembers. It remembers the patience. It remembers the listening. It remembers the hands that carved without anger. And if you stand there long enough, out of the wind, out of the noise, you understand something that modern life forgets too easily. Survival was never about dominance. It was about humility, about learning when not to fight, about knowing that the strongest shelter isn't the one that stands against the storm, but the one the storm forgets is even there. And if stories like this matter to you, if you want to uncover more forgotten methods, quiet solutions, and survival wisdom that modern thinking left behind, make sure you subscribe. These aren't just stories. They're lessons carved into time, and there are many more waiting to be remembered.